On their first day of marriage, her millionaire husband divorced her, laughing, "I only married you for entertainment." 9 months later, he found her in a hospital bed, giving birth to his twins. Hi, my beautiful and loyal family. Welcome home to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty surround every woman with a shield of unbreakable strength, a river of healing, and a peace that silences every storm sent to destroy her. May every hidden battle she fought alone become the reason God lifts her higher than she ever dreamed. You are the quiet miracle behind every victory, the heartbeat of every home, the warrior who rises even when the world expects you to fall. May your tears turn into triumph, your scars into wisdom, and your silence into a testimony that shakes the heavens. My precious family, your voice matters here. Your presence keeps this home alive. A like is a prayer released. A comment is a chain broken. This is Mission 1000 likes, for every woman who carried the world on her shoulders and still found the strength to love. If you carry fire in your soul, like this video. If you walk in faith and courage, comment, "I'm with Mr. Peter." The champagne was still cold in her hand when Goldsmith signed the divorce papers with a smile that could cut glass. Tanya Finch stood in the presidential suite of the Meridian Grand Hotel, her wedding dress catching the city lights that poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. The fabric felt heavy now, suffocating, like burial clothes. Gold sat at the marble table with documents spread before him, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his expression radiating satisfaction that made her stomach turn. The pen moved across paper with practiced ease, his signature a flourish of certainty. "There," he said, sliding the papers toward her. "All legal." All done. 6 hours of marriage officially erased. Tanya's fingers trembled around the champagne flute. The bubbles had gone flat while she'd been standing here listening to him explain how every moment of their relationship had been performance art. 3 months of courtship. 3 months of him learning her rhythms, her fears, her dreams of designing hotels that could make people feel safe. 3 months of him asking about her dead parents, holding her through nightmares, promising her a family to replace the one she'd lost. All of it calculated, all of it scripted. "The bet was simple," Gold continued, leaning back in his chair with the casual posture of someone discussing a successful business deal. $2 million that I could convince a woman to marry me within 30 days and divorce her the same night. My friends thought it was impossible. They said women would see through it, that I couldn't fake sincerity long enough. He laughed, the sound echoing off expensive walls. "But I picked you specifically, Tanya. You were so earnest, so desperate to believe in fairy tales, so alone that you'd cling to anyone who showed you warmth." She had slept with him hours ago, before the ceremony, in this same suite, when he'd pulled her close and whispered that he couldn't wait until tonight, that he needed her now. She'd believed it was passion, believed his hands on her skin meant something beyond transaction. The memory made bile rise in her throat. "I documented everything," Gold said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through photos. "Every date, every kiss. My friends wanted proof I was really trying. Look, here's the night I told you I loved you. You cried. It was perfect." He showed her the screen, a photo of her face wet with tears, radiant with joy, taken without her knowledge. "I even recorded some of our conversations, the one where you talked about your mother dying when you were 12. That one got a standing ovation at the poker game." Tanya set down the champagne flute carefully because her hands wanted to throw it. She looked at the divorce papers, at the neat legal language that transformed their marriage into something that never existed. "An annulment on grounds of fraud," the document said, as if that word could contain what he'd done. At the bottom was a payment agreement, $50,000 for her participation in his entertainment, his lawyer had called it, compensation for her time. "You don't have to look so tragic," Gold said, standing and walking to the bar to pour himself whiskey. "It's not personal. You're a nice woman, really, just gullible. And honestly, you should thank me. $50,000 for 3 months of dating. That's better than you'd make at your little architecture firm all year." He swirled the whiskey, studying the amber liquid. Plus, you got a story. Women love stories. You can tell your friends about the crazy rich guy who married you as a joke. They'll buy you drinks and call me a monster. You'll dine out on this for years. Something inside Tanya cracked then, something she'd spent her whole life protecting. She picked up the pen and signed the papers without reading them. Her signature looked nothing like her, shaky, broken, the letters barely forming. She left the pen on the table. She left the check. She walked toward the door in her wedding dress, her heels clicking against imported tile. "Don't forget your things," Gold called after her. "You left a toothbrush in the bathroom, and there's a suitcase in the closet." Tanya kept walking. She reached the door, opened it, stepped into the hallway. Behind her, she heard Gold's voice, closer now, following her to the elevator. "Tanya, seriously, at least take the money. Don't be stupid about this." She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened immediately. She stepped inside and finally turned to look at him. Gold stood in the hallway in his tuxedo pants and white shirt, holding the check, his expression somewhere between amusement and exasperation. He looked like a man who'd won a bet and couldn't understand why his opponent wouldn't shake hands and admit defeat. The elevator doors started to close. Gold suddenly moved forward, jamming his hand between them to stop them. They bounced back open. He held out the check one more time. "Take it," he said. "You earned it. You played your part perfectly." Tanya looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who had never been told no, who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way past, who genuinely believed that money made cruelty acceptable. She reached out and took the check from his hand. For a moment, Gold's face showed satisfaction. Then Tanya tore the check in half, then in half again, and let the pieces fall between them like snow. The elevator doors closed on Gold's surprised face. Tanya rode down alone, her reflection staring back at her from mirrored walls. She looked like a ghost in white, her dark skin ashen, her eyes hollow. In the lobby, people turned to stare at the woman in a wedding dress walking through at midnight. She heard whispers, saw phones lift to take photos. She pushed through the revolving doors and stepped onto the street where rain had started falling. She walked 6 blocks before her legs stopped working. She sat down on a bus stop bench, the rain soaking through her dress, and stared at nothing. A homeless man approached and asked if she was okay. She couldn't answer. He sat with her until the rain stopped, not speaking, just present. When she finally stood, he wished her luck. She walked home to her apartment and stood under a scalding shower until the water ran cold. 3 weeks later, Tanya took a pregnancy test in the bathroom of a drugstore because she couldn't bear to do it at home. The positive result appeared within seconds, 2 lines stark against white plastic. She sat on the closed toilet lid, holding the test, and understood that Goldsmith would be connected to her forever through this biological accident. She thought about her options with clinical precision. She could end it. She could tell him. She could disappear. That night, she called a lawyer who confirmed that annulment meant Gold had legally chosen to erase the marriage, which meant any children from that union had no automatic paternal claim. The lawyer explained that if she never named him, never sought support, never filed any documentation connecting him to the children, he would have no legal rights without a lengthy court battle where he'd have to prove paternity and explain why he wanted access after abandoning their mother. Tanya made her choice. She quit her job the next morning via email. She withdrew her savings, $32,000 saved over years of careful budgeting. She packed 2 suitcases with clothes and her laptop. She left behind everything else, furniture, books, photos, the life she'd tried to build in a city that now felt poisonous. She took a bus to a coastal town she'd visited once as a child, a place small enough that no one knew Goldsmith's name, quiet enough that she could disappear into ordinary life. She rented a cottage with peeling paint and a view of the sea. She registered with freelance platforms under her middle name, offering architectural consulting to small firms who needed expertise but couldn't afford full-time staff. She bought prenatal vitamins and maternity clothes from thrift stores. She attended doctor appointments alone, filling out intake forms that asked for the father's medical history and left that section blank. At night, she stood on the cottage porch and watched the ocean while two lives grew inside her body. She didn't think about gold. She thought about her mother, who had died alone in a hospital while Tanya sat in a 7th-grade classroom learning algebra. She thought about her father, who had followed her mother into death 3 years later because grief had made his heart simply stop. She thought about being 12 years old and learning that love could be taken without warning, without mercy, without appeal. She put her hands on her growing belly and made a promise to whoever was inside. You will never know cruelty disguised as affection. You will never be a bet. You will be loved without conditions, or I will die trying. Goldsmith received a package at his office on a Tuesday morning. Inside was a single wedding photograph, torn precisely in half. His half showed him smiling at the camera. Tanya's half was missing. There was no note, no return address. Just the image of a man standing alone in a tuxedo, grinning at something he'd already destroyed. Chapter 2. Birth and Blood. Goldsmith had not expected to be in a hospital at 3 in the morning, but Mitchell Carver's heart had forced his hand. Mitchell was 78 and owned the largest luxury hotel chain in Southeast Asia. He'd been in the middle of proposing a partnership worth hundreds of millions when his face had turned grey and his left hand had started clawing at his chest. Gold had called the ambulance, ridden with Mitchell to Coastal Regional Medical Center, and now sat in an uncomfortable waiting room chair while doctors worked on his business partner. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. Gold hated hospitals. He'd spent too many nights in one watching his father die slowly, watching morphine turn a ruthless businessman into someone who cried at television commercials. He stood and walked the hallways because sitting still made him think, and thinking lately had become uncomfortable. He'd won his bet, collected his $2 million, told the story at parties where people laughed and called him savage. But something had shifted after that night. He'd started waking up at strange hours, remembering Tanya's face when he'd explained the bet, the way her expression had emptied of everything human. He'd told himself it was guilt and guilt was useless. He'd moved on, but then the torn photograph had arrived and he hadn't been able to throw it away. Gold turned a corner and found himself near the maternity ward. He could hear babies crying behind closed doors, could see new fathers through observation windows holding infants with terrified gentleness. He almost turned back. Then he glanced through a partially open doorway and saw her. Tanya Finch was in a hospital bed, her body arched in pain, her face slick with sweat. A nurse stood beside her checking monitors that beeped urgently. A doctor entered the room quickly, snapping on gloves, her voice calm but firm. Gold couldn't hear the words. He stood frozen in the hallway, pressed against the wall like a thief, watching. Tanya's hospital gown was soaked through. Her hair was plastered to her skull. She made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like something being ripped from inside her body. The doctor was saying something about blood pressure, about complications, about needing to move quickly. More staff entered the room. Gold saw IV bags being hung, saw someone injecting something into the IV line, saw Tanya's hand grip the bed rail so hard her knuckles went pale. The door swung wider as more medical staff rushed in, and Gold had a clear view when they delivered the first baby. It came out purple and silent. The doctor moved with practiced speed, suctioning the infant's mouth and nose. There was a terrible moment of silence. Then the baby screamed, and the sound was so raw and vital that Gold felt something crack in his chest. The nurse carried the infant to a warming table, and Gold saw it was a boy, but Tanya was still screaming. The doctor's voice changed pitch, became more urgent. Another baby. Gold watched as they delivered the second child, another boy, this one crying immediately. Twins. The word hit him like a physical blow. 2 sons, 2 children who existed because of one night when he'd thought cruelty was a game. Then he saw the blood. It was spreading across the sheets faster than it should, darker than it should. The nurse called for the attending. Someone else ran out of the room, their footsteps pounding down the hallway. Gold heard the word hemorrhage. He heard someone call for the operating room to be prepped. He saw Tanya's face go slack, saw her eyes roll back, saw the doctor slam her hand on Tanya's chest and start giving orders in a voice that cut through chaos. They were losing her. Gold understood that with perfect clarity. Tanya was bleeding out in a hospital bed while her newborn sons cried in plastic bassinets. He stood paralyzed, watching the medical team fight to save a woman he'd destroyed. Minutes stretched. A doctor emerged and grabbed a passing resident, demanded blood products, demanded more hands. Gold heard fragments of conversation: placental abruption, disseminated intravascular coagulation, emergency hysterectomy if they couldn't stop the bleeding. The door closed, blocking his view. Gold slid down the wall and sat on the floor in the hallway with his back against cold plaster. He sat there for hours. Mitchell Carver's assistant called his phone repeatedly. Gold didn't answer. He sat and listened to babies crying behind closed doors, listened to nurses moving past him, listened to the sound of his own breathing that felt somehow wrong, too easy, when Tanya might be dying down the hall. At dawn, a doctor emerged from Tanya's room. She was a small woman with grey hair and the kind of exhaustion that came from saving lives. She spoke to a nurse about moving the patient to recovery, about monitoring her for the next 24 hours, about the transfusions stabilizing her condition. Gold heard her say Tanya had lost nearly half her blood volume. He heard her say it had been close, too close. Gold stood slowly, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie loosened. He approached the nurse's station with the kind of authority that came naturally to men with his bank account. He asked about the patient in room 412, said he was family, said he needed to know if she was stable. The nurse, harried and trusting, told him Tanya was critical but recovering. Told him the twins were healthy, 7 pounds each, no complications. Told him the mother had asked for no visitors, no contact, wanted to be left alone with her babies. Gold asked if there was a father listed. The nurse checked the chart and shook her head. No father. No family, no emergency contact, just a woman and 2 newborns facing the world alone. He went to the cafeteria because his hands were shaking and he needed to be anywhere else. He sat with coffee he didn't drink and thought about Tanya lying in that bed hemorrhaging while he'd stood in the hallway like a spectator. He thought about how she'd disappeared after the divorce, how he'd assumed she'd gone back to her small life and forgotten him. He thought about her being pregnant through all the months he'd been collecting his bet money and laughing about his wedding night performance. He thought about her going into labor alone, terrified, with no one to hold her hand or tell her she'd survive this. His phone buzzed with another call from Mitchell's assistant. Gold answered this time and learned Mitchell was stable, would recover, wanted to resume their meeting next week. Gold said something appropriate and ended the call. He sat in the cafeteria until visiting hours started, then walked back to the maternity ward. He found Tanya's room number on the board, room 412. He stood outside the door, his hand on the handle. Through the small window, he could see her. Tanya was sitting up in bed, pale as death but alive. She held one baby while the other slept in a bassinet beside her. Her face was different than he remembered, harder, leaner, carved by suffering he'd initiated. She was looking down at the baby in her arms with an expression Gold had never seen before, something so fierce and protective it made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance. Gold stood outside that door for 30 minutes watching. A nurse entered and asked Tanya questions about pain levels, about whether she needed more medication. Gold heard Tanya's voice for the first time in months. It was hoarse from screaming, but steady. She said she was managing. She said she wanted to go home as soon as possible. She said she could handle this. The nurse left, and Gold watched Tanya shift the baby to her other arm with practiced care that suggested she'd been learning fast. The second baby started fussing, and Tanya somehow maneuvered both infants into her arms, holding them against her chest, rocking slightly. She was singing something too quiet for Gold to hear through the door. Both babies settled. Gold turned and walked away. He took the elevator down, walked through the lobby, got into his car. He sat in the parking lot with his hands on the steering wheel and his heart beating in a rhythm that felt wrong. He started the engine. He drove home to his penthouse that suddenly felt too large, too empty, too full of furniture that served no purpose except to prove he could afford it. He showered. He changed into fresh clothes. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop and stared at the screen without seeing it. Then he pulled out his phone and called a private investigator he'd used before for business purposes. The man answered on the second ring. "I need you to find out everything about someone," Gold said. "Where she's been, how she survived, what her life looks like now. I need details. I need facts. I need to know what happened to her after she left me." The investigator asked for a name. Gold gave it. Tanya Finch. He spelled it slowly, precisely. He added that she'd just given birth to twins at Coastal Regional Medical Center. He said to be discreet but thorough. He said money was no object. The investigator asked one more question. "Are you the father?" Gold sat in his penthouse office, surrounded by evidence of his success. His walls covered with awards and photos of properties he owned, his desk solid mahogany worth more than most people's cars. He looked at his reflection in the darkened window, a man alone in a tower asking strangers to investigate a woman he'd broken because he couldn't stop thinking about whether those children shared his DNA. "I don't know," Gold said, and realized it was the first honest thing he'd said in months. "That's what I'm paying you to find out." Chapter 3. The Investigation. The investigator's first report arrived by encrypted email 3 days after Gold had watched Tanya nearly die on a hospital bed. Gold opened it in his office at 3 in the afternoon, between a conference call with investors and a site inspection of a new property. The document was thorough in the way that expensive surveillance always was. Dates, locations, photographs, witness statements from people who'd been paid to remember seeing a pregnant woman at coffee shops and grocery stores. Gold read it twice, then a third time, his coffee going cold beside him. Tanya had left the city the day after their divorce. She'd taken a bus to Harborview, a coastal town with a population just under 8,000, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and strangers were noticed. She'd rented a cottage on Ocean View Road, a street 2 blocks from the water where houses were small and weathered and cheap. The landlord remembered her because she'd paid 6 months' rent up front in cash, because she'd been quiet and polite, because she'd asked if the cottage had good insulation, because she'd be working from home. The investigator had interviewed the landlord, a woman named Ruth Patterson, who owned 3 rental properties and seemed happy to gossip for money. Ruth said Tanya kept to herself, never complained, paid rent on time every month. Said she'd noticed Tanya was pregnant around the 4th month, but didn't ask questions because young women had their reasons for doing things alone. Said she'd seen Tanya working on a laptop on the porch sometimes, designing what looked like buildings on complicated software. The report included Tanya's work history. She'd registered on freelance platforms under her middle name, Tanya Louise, offering architectural consulting services. She'd done small projects for regional firms, mostly residential designs and commercial renovations. She'd made enough to cover rent, food, prenatal care, and nothing else. The investigator had accessed her bank records through methods Gold didn't want to examine too closely. She had $400 in her checking account. Her savings were gone. There were photographs. The investigator had been watching her for days, taking pictures that felt like violations. Tanya, at 7 months pregnant, walking on the beach alone in a jacket too thin for the wind. Tanya, at 8 months, carrying groceries into her cottage, her belly huge under a worn sweater. Tanya, at 9 months, sitting on her porch with her laptop, her face concentrating on something beyond the camera's understanding. In every photograph, she was alone. No friends, no family, no man. Just a woman surviving through determination that looked exhausting, even in still images. Gold studied one photograph longer than the others. Tanya stood at the edge of the water with her hand on her swollen belly, her face turned toward the horizon. She looked older than she had on their wedding night. Not in years, but in experience. The kind of aging that came from having illusions burned away. Her expression was impossible to read. Neither happy nor sad, just present in a moment that existed outside his observation. The second report arrived a week later with the paternity results. The investigator had bribed a hospital employee to obtain genetic material from the twins during routine heel-stick blood tests. Gold had provided his own sample. The laboratory results were definitive. Probability of paternity 99.9%. The twins were his biological sons. Gold sat in his office with those results and felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child, being called into his father's study to explain poor grades. Not quite fear, but recognition that his actions had consequences he couldn't buy his way past. He'd created two human beings during a night he'd considered a performance. Those beings existed now, separate from his intentions, crying and sleeping and growing in a cottage by the sea. He tried to work. He had meetings with architects about a new hotel in Dubai, negotiations with suppliers, conference calls with his board of directors. He went through the motions with mechanical precision, while his mind stayed fixed on a woman he'd destroyed and children he'd never intended to create. His assistant asked if he was feeling well. His business partners commented that he seemed distracted. Gold said he was fine and continued functioning while something fundamental shifted inside him. The third report came 2 weeks after the birth. The investigator had followed Tanya home from the hospital, had documented her struggle to get 2 infant car seats up the stairs of her cottage while recovering from major blood loss, had photographed her exhaustion through windows he must have stood outside like a prowler. Gold read the report and felt sick. Tanya was managing alone. She'd set up 2 cribs in her small bedroom, had been seen walking the porch at midnight with babies who wouldn't sleep, had been observed sitting on her front steps at dawn, feeding one infant while the other cried inside. The investigator had found no evidence of family support, no visitors, no help. Just Tanya moving through early motherhood with the kind of determination that looked like survival. Gold made a decision. He got in his car and drove 4 hours to Harborview, found Ocean View Road, parked down the street from the cottage. He sat there for hours watching Tanya's life through windows like the investigator had, seeing her move through rooms with a baby in her arms, seeing the lights stay on all night because infants didn't care about exhaustion. He came back the next day, and the next. He told himself he was checking on his sons, making sure they were safe, confirming Tanya was capable of managing alone. He told himself these were reasonable concerns. He didn't admit he was watching her because he couldn't stop thinking about the expression on her face in that hospital bed when she'd thought she might die. On the 4th morning, Tanya came onto the porch holding one baby while the other cried inside. She was wearing clothes that hung loose on her postpartum body, her hair uncombed, her face marked by sleeplessness. She stood there in the early light, rocking the infant mechanically, and looked directly at Gold's car. Their eyes met across 50 feet of distance. Gold's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Tanya didn't look surprised or afraid. She looked at him the way someone might look at a stain that kept reappearing no matter how much you scrubbed. She stared at him for 30 seconds, her face expressionless, the baby in her arms fussing. Then she turned, walked back into the cottage, and closed the door. Gold sat in his car, waiting for something. Police, confrontation, acknowledgement. Nothing happened. The cottage door stayed closed. After an hour, he drove back to the city feeling like he'd been dismissed by someone who'd already spent too much time thinking about him. But he couldn't stay away. He came back a week later, parked in the same spot, watched the same windows. This time, Tanya didn't come out. She moved through her cottage doing whatever mothers did, feeding, changing, soothing, surviving, and ignored the expensive car parked on her street. Gold watched her carry both babies at once, one in each arm, moving from room to room with practiced efficiency. He watched her sit on the porch steps at midnight, rocking a crying infant while the other slept inside. He watched her walk to the corner store with both babies strapped to her chest in carriers, buying formula and diapers with careful attention to prices. She never looked at his car again. She acted as if he didn't exist, as if the man watching her life from a distance was no more significant than a stranger passing through town. Her indifference was more devastating than anger would have been. On the 3rd week of surveillance, Gold decided to stop being a coward. He got out of his car and walked to the cottage door. He could hear babies crying inside, could hear Tanya's voice singing something soft and tuneless. He knocked. The singing stopped. Footsteps approached. The door opened 6 inches, stopped by a chain lock. Tanya looked at him through the gap. She was holding one baby. The other was crying somewhere behind her. She didn't ask what he wanted. She didn't ask why he was there. She just looked at him with eyes that had learned not to expect anything from men who made promises. "I know they're mine," Gold said. The words came out wrong, possessive, like he was claiming ownership of something he'd purchased. Tanya's expression didn't change. "You signed papers that said we were never married. That means those children have no father. Leave, or I'll call the police for harassment." She closed the door. Gold heard the lock engage. He stood on the porch, listening to babies crying and Tanya's voice soothing them, and understood she'd built walls he couldn't scale with money or charm or persistence. She'd done the math and decided he was worth exactly nothing in her children's lives. Gold walked back to his car and sat there until dark. Then he drove home and called his lawyer. He asked about paternity rights, about custody, about legal options for fathers who weren't named on birth certificates. His lawyer explained it would require a court battle, DNA tests, publicity, explanations about why he wanted access to children he'd abandoned for months. Gold hung up and sat in his penthouse, wondering when he'd become the kind of man who had to take a woman to court to see his own children, wondering why he wanted to see them at all, wondering if wanting them now made him more or less monstrous than not wanting them in the first place. He pulled up the photographs from the investigators' reports and looked at Tanya standing on the beach with her hand on her pregnant belly. He looked at her face, trying to find the woman he'd married and destroyed. She was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who'd learned to survive him, someone who'd decided he didn't deserve a second chance. Gold set down his phone and looked around his penthouse at furniture that cost more than Tanya spent in 6 months, at art on the walls purchased because his decorator said it was important, at a life built entirely around accumulation with nothing accumulated that mattered. His sons were growing up in a cottage with peeling paint, while he sat in a tower made of glass and money, and for the first time since signing those divorce papers, Gold understood he might have lost something he couldn't buy back. Chapter 4. The Fortress. Tanya's lawyer was a woman named Jennifer Moss, who worked out of a small office above a coffee shop in Harborview and charged rates Tanya could barely afford. Jennifer reviewed Gold's initial contact attempts, the messages through her office, the flowers that appeared on Tanya's porch, the certified letters demanding acknowledgement of paternity, and built a fortress of paperwork that kept him legally distant. She explained to Tanya that the annulment Gold had insisted upon gave them leverage. He'd chosen to erase the marriage. He'd paid lawyers to ensure it never legally existed. Now that decision protected Tanya in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The law, Jennifer explained with satisfaction, didn't automatically grant parental rights to biological fathers who'd abandoned mothers. Gold would have to petition for paternity testing, then petition for custody or visitation, then prove to a judge why access to these children would serve their best interests when he'd demonstrated clear disinterest for months. And all of that would require public court proceedings where his wedding night bet would become part of the official record. Tanya listened and felt nothing except relief that law could function as distance. She signed papers that Jennifer prepared, formal responses denying Gold's claims, legal documents asserting her sole custody, notices that any further contact would be considered harassment. Jennifer filed everything with efficient precision, and Gold's attempts to reach Tanya stopped. Not because he gave up, but because his lawyer had clearly explained how badly he'd positioned himself. Meanwhile, Tanya was drowning. Her twins, she'd named them Zephyr and Phoenix in the hospital, names that meant wind and rebirth, names that had nothing to do with Goldsmith or his world, were relentless. They woke every 2 hours. They cried in harmony. They needed constant feeding, changing, holding, soothing. Tanya moved through days without clear boundaries between waking and sleeping, her body operating on instinct while her mind went numb. She worked when she could, taking on small projects that paid poorly but didn't require site visits. She designed a restaurant renovation for a couple in Portland who wanted modern rustic, drew up plans for a beach house addition, consulted on a hotel lobby redesign. She worked with babies strapped to her chest or sleeping in bouncy seats beside her desk or crying while she tried to concentrate. She invoiced clients and prayed they'd pay quickly because her savings were gone and her rent was due. She bought the cheapest diapers, the store-brand formula, clothes from thrift stores that sometimes smelled like other people's lives even after washing. She ate oatmeal and peanut butter sandwiches because they were filling and cheap. She lost weight her body couldn't afford to lose while producing milk for two infants who seemed perpetually hungry. One evening at a grocery store, Tanya stood in the aisle calculating costs with a precision born of necessity. She needed formula, diapers, baby soap, something for herself to eat. She put items in her cart, checked the total on her phone calculator, put items back. Formula was non-negotiable, diapers were non-negotiable. That left $8 for food for herself for the week. She was deciding between rice and pasta when she felt someone watching her. Gold stood at the end of the aisle wearing a suit that probably cost what Tanya paid in rent. He looked at her cart, the generic formula, the cheapest diapers, the calculation happening in real time as she sacrificed her own needs for her children. His face did something complicated, an expression Tanya didn't care enough to interpret. He approached slowly, carefully, like she was an animal that might bolt. Tanya. She didn't respond. She put rice in her cart and moved toward checkout. Gold followed. "Let me pay for your groceries, please. You shouldn't have to choose between feeding yourself and feeding them." Tanya stopped walking and turned to look at him. Other shoppers moved around them, annoyed at the obstruction. Tanya's twins were asleep in their carriers attached to the shopping cart, their small faces peaceful in a way they never were at home. She looked at Gold and remembered his laughter on their wedding night, remembered him explaining how he'd recorded her grief for entertainment, remembered signing divorce papers while still in her wedding dress. "I'd rather eat nothing than take a cent from a man who bet money on breaking my heart," she said. She walked to checkout, paid with her debit card, prayed it wouldn't decline. It went through with $7 remaining in her account. She loaded groceries into bags and carried them out to her car, with Gold standing in the aisle watching her leave. That night, Tanya fed her sons and ate plain rice with salt, and thought about pride and whether it was worth starving over. She decided it was. She'd survived everything else. She could survive poverty too. But survival was becoming a question rather than a certainty. Her freelance work was sporadic. Her body was still recovering from childbirth and blood loss that had nearly killed her. Her twins were growing, needing more, demanding attention she had to split between them. She was so tired, she sometimes hallucinated, seeing her dead mother standing in doorways, seeing shadows move like threats. One midnight when both babies were screaming and Tanya had been awake for 36 hours straight, she sat on her bathroom floor and cried for the first time since leaving the hospital. She cried because she was alone. She cried because she was failing. She cried because her children deserved better than a mother who could barely function. She cried until she heard Phoenix's screams reach a pitch that meant real distress. Then she stood up and went back to being what they needed her to be. She didn't know that her neighbor in the cottage next door had heard everything through the thin walls. She didn't know that Dr. Silas Hartwell, who'd moved in 2 weeks earlier, had been lying awake listening to her struggle every night, wondering if he should offer help or if that would be an invasion. She didn't know that he'd been in that same place once, alone with a loss too big to carry, wondering how to keep living when living took more strength than he possessed. The next morning, Tanya found groceries on her porch. Good groceries. Fresh vegetables, quality formula, expensive diapers, real food. There was no note, no name. Just bags of supplies left like a miracle. Tanya looked at the offering and then at the cottage next door. Through the window she saw a man she'd nodded to once in passing. Tall, quiet, with dark hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much death. He was drinking coffee at his kitchen window. When he saw her looking, he raised his mug slightly in greeting but didn't smile or wave or act like he expected gratitude. Tanya took the groceries inside and fed her children and ate fresh food for the first time in weeks. She didn't thank him. She didn't acknowledge the gift. She just survived one more day. But the next week, when groceries appeared again, she knocked on his door. The man answered wearing scrubs with a hospital ID badge that identified him as Dr. Silas Hartwell, trauma surgery. He looked at her without speaking, waiting. "I can't pay you back," Tanya said, "but I can't keep taking your money either." Silas considered this. "I'm not keeping track. I hear your babies through the walls. I know you're alone. I was alone once. People helped me. Now I'm helping you. That's the only math that matters." He closed the door gently, ending the conversation before Tanya could argue. She stood on his porch, holding Phoenix and feeling something she hadn't felt in months. The possibility that not every man was Goldsmith, that kindness might exist without transaction, that maybe survival didn't have to be entirely solitary. Inside his cottage, Silas leaned against the closed door and thought about the woman next door raising 2 infants alone, thought about his wife who died giving birth to their daughter, who died 10 minutes later, thought about how grief made you either cruel or kind, and there was no middle ground. He'd chosen kind because cruelty would have destroyed him. Through the wall, he heard Tanya singing to her babies, her voice carrying through plaster and studs, and he decided he'd keep leaving groceries until she stopped needing them, or told him to stop, whichever came first. Gold sat in his car down the street watching a man he didn't know carry supplies into Tanya's cottage. He watched Tanya answer her door, watched her stand there talking to a stranger who seemed comfortable in her space. He watched something that looked like gratitude cross her face, watched her go back inside, watched lights turn on in both cottages as evening fell. His investigator's new report would identify the man as Dr. Silas Hartwell, surgeon, widower, recently relocated from Seattle. The report would note that Silas had been observed helping with the twins, had been seen on Tanya's porch holding one baby while she dealt with the other, had been photographed making her laugh. Gold would read that report and understand he wasn't just losing a custody battle. He was losing his children to another man's presence, his sons learning to recognize a voice that wasn't his, small hands reaching for arms that weren't his. He'd thrown Tanya away like she was garbage. Now someone else was proving she was treasure. He started the car and drove back to his empty penthouse where no one needed him, where nothing he owned required his care, where success felt hollow and money felt stupid. He sat in the dark and tried to remember why he'd thought the bet was funny, why he'd signed those papers with a smile, why he'd believed cruelty was acceptable when wrapped in expensive sheets. He couldn't remember. That night felt like it belonged to someone else now. Some version of himself he didn't recognize anymore. But that version had made choices this version had to live with. And those choices had consequences named Zephyr and Phoenix, who were learning to smile at a stranger, while their biological father sat in a tower made of glass and regret. Chapter 5. The Professional Collision. The acquisition proposal arrived on Gold's desk on a Tuesday morning with the kind of fanfare that signaled major money. Meridian International wanted to purchase his hotel empire for $500 million. They planned to expand operations into the luxury market, wanted his flagship properties, valued his brand recognition. The deal included retention of him as CEO with a seat on their board, stock options, performance bonuses that would make him even wealthier than he already was. His lawyers called it the opportunity of a decade. His financial advisors called it smart business. Gold signed the preliminary agreements and felt nothing except the familiar numbness that had settled into his chest since watching Tanya nearly die. The first meeting with Meridian's acquisition team was scheduled for the following week. Gold prepared by reviewing their portfolio, their expansion strategy, their market position. He was good at this kind of analysis, at seeing numbers and understanding what they meant in terms of power and growth. He'd built his empire on the ability to read balance sheets like poetry and find opportunity in risk. The meeting started precisely at 9. Meridian's team filled his conference room, executives in expensive suits, lawyers with briefcases, financial analysts with tablets. Gold went through his presentation explaining property values, occupancy rates, revenue projections. The Meridian CEO asked intelligent questions. The lawyers took notes. Everything proceeded according to script. Then the design team entered, and Gold's carefully constructed composure shattered. Tanya Finch walked through the door wearing professional clothes that hung slightly loose on her still-recovering body, carrying a portfolio case and a laptop, her face composed in an expression of absolute neutrality. She saw him. Her step didn't falter. She sat down, opened her laptop, and pulled up architectural renderings as if Gold was any other client she'd never met before. The Meridian CEO introduced her as their lead architect for the expansion project, praised her innovative designs, mentioned her growing reputation for sustainable luxury. Tanya stood and began her presentation. Her voice was steady, confident, transformed from the exhausted woman Gold had watched struggling in a grocery store. She explained her vision for renovating his flagship hotel, modernizing while maintaining character, incorporating green technology, redesigning public spaces to create intimacy within grandeur. Her designs were extraordinary. Gold had reviewed hundreds of architectural proposals over the years. These were better than anything he'd seen. Tanya had taken his hotel and reimagined it as something both functional and beautiful, had solved problems he hadn't known existed, had created spaces that would make guests feel wealthy and welcome simultaneously. The Meridian team was clearly impressed. They asked technical questions. Tanya answered with precise expertise, citing building codes and material costs and construction timelines with the fluency of someone who understood every detail. Gold sat at the head of the table and watched the woman he'd destroyed command a room full of men who hung on her words. She'd rebuilt herself. She'd taken her talent and created a professional reputation that had nothing to do with him, had worked her way into this contract through skill and determination, had survived his cruelty and become more successful than she'd been before. The realization was devastating. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Tanya never looked at Gold directly. She addressed the room, made eye contact with everyone except him, treated his presence like an irrelevant detail. When the Meridian team asked if Gold had questions about the designs, Tanya finally met his gaze with eyes that held no emotion whatsoever. Gold opened his mouth and found he had nothing to say. He nodded his approval. The meeting ended. People filed out toward lunch. Gold stood and intercepted Tanya in the hallway before she could disappear. She stopped walking but didn't turn to face him. He moved around to block her path. Up close, he could see exhaustion beneath her makeup, could see she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, could see the careful construction of her professional armor. "You didn't tell me you were taking this contract," Gold said. Tanya looked at him with the expression of someone addressing a mildly annoying obstacle. "I don't report my professional decisions to you. I took a job. You happen to be tangentially involved. That's not my concern." "Tanya, we don't need to talk about anything. I'm here to work. If you have feedback on my designs, submit it through the proper channels." She moved to step around him. Gold blocked her again. "I know you need this money. I know you're struggling. Let me help. Let me set up an account for the twins. Let me pay for—" "I'm taking this contract because I earned it with my talent, not because you're offering charity." Tanya's voice was flat, factual. "My financial situation is none of your business. My children are none of your business. I'm a professional contractor working on a project where you're a stakeholder. That's the extent of our relationship." She stepped around him successfully this time and walked toward the elevator. Gold stood in the hallway, watching her leave for the second time in his life, watching her back disappear as she chose to exit rather than engage. Other people moved past him, colleagues, Meridian executives, his own assistant asking about lunch plans. Gold ignored them all. He went back to his office and closed the door and sat at his desk, staring at nothing. The project moved forward. Tanya came to weekly meetings, presented updates, coordinated with construction teams, solved problems with efficient creativity. She treated Gold with perfect professional courtesy and absolute personal indifference. She called him Mr. Smith. She copied him on emails using formal language. She never stayed after meetings to chat, never accepted invitations to client dinners, maintained boundaries so clear they felt like walls built from ice. Gold watched her from across conference tables and learned things about her he'd never known during their brief marriage. She was brilliant at problem solving, could see three-dimensional space in her mind and translate it to drawings that contractors understood. She was patient with difficult clients, diplomatic with demanding timelines, firm when people tried to compromise her designs. She commanded respect through competence, and men who would normally dismiss a young woman listened when she explained why their ideas wouldn't work. She'd become this person without him. She'd taken the wreckage he'd created and built something better. He'd thought destroying her was entertainment. She'd proven destruction was just the first chapter of a longer story. Weeks passed. Gold found excuses to be at meetings Tanya attended, found reasons to review her work personally rather than delegating to assistants. He told himself it was due diligence. He didn't admit he was looking for cracks in her armor, hoping to see the woman who'd cried at his declaration of love, hoping some part of her still existed beneath the professional distance. One evening, after a late meeting about construction delays, Gold saw Tanya's phone light up on the conference table. She was gathering her materials, preparing to leave. The name on the screen was Silas. Gold watched her face transform. Softness replacing the careful neutrality, a small smile appearing like sun through clouds. She answered the phone with warmth that felt like a knife in his chest. "I'm on my way home now," Tanya said, her voice completely different than it had been 10 seconds earlier when she'd been discussing load-bearing walls. "Did they eat okay? Tell them Mama loves them. I'll be there in 30 minutes. She ended the call and looked up to find Gold staring at her. Her face went neutral again, professional armor slamming back into place. She picked up her phone and her laptop and walked out without saying goodbye. Gold sat alone in the conference room and understood that someone named Silas was in his son's lives, was watching them while Tanya worked, was receiving her warm voice and her smiles while Gold received her cold courtesy. He called his investigator that night and requested comprehensive surveillance. He needed to know who Silas was, what role he played, how deeply he'd embedded himself in the life that should have been Gold's. The report arrived 48 hours later, with photographs that destroyed what remained of Gold's delusions. Dr. Silas Hartwell on Tanya's porch holding Zephyr while she held Phoenix. Silas fixing a broken step on her cottage while the twins slept in carriers nearby. Silas and Tanya walking on the beach, each carrying a baby, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that suggested intimacy developing. Silas making Tanya laugh, actually laugh, her head thrown back, her face radiant, while Phoenix grabbed at his hair. The investigator's report detailed Silas's background. Widower. Lost his wife and newborn daughter 3 years ago to childbirth complications. Moved to Harborview to start over. Trauma surgeon at the regional hospital. Quiet, private, well-respected by colleagues. No criminal history, no scandals, no hidden cruelty. Just a good man who'd survived tragedy and was learning to live again by helping a woman survive hers. Gold read the report 3 times and felt rage and something worse than rage. The recognition that he was being replaced by someone who deserved what Gold had thrown away. Silas hadn't needed to be coached to be kind. He'd seen a woman struggling and helped without expecting anything in return. He'd earned his place in Tanya's life through presence and consistency and the simple act of showing up. Gold had shown up too late and for the wrong reasons. He'd shown up because guilt hurt, and watching Tanya survive without him made him feel unnecessary. He'd shown up because his sons existed, and he wanted credit for their existence without having done any work to deserve them. He'd shown up because losing felt unfamiliar, and he didn't know how to accept defeat. Silas had shown up because someone needed help, and he had help to give, and that difference meant everything. Gold sat in his penthouse, holding photographs of another man raising his children, and understood he'd lost not just a custody battle, but something more fundamental. He'd lost the right to matter in their lives. He'd signed those papers erasing his marriage. Now he was erased. Zephyr and Phoenix would grow up knowing Silas's face, Silas's voice, Silas's arms. They'd learn to walk, holding Silas's hands. They'd call someone else father, while Gold sat in a tower built from money that suddenly felt worthless. He couldn't accept it. He wouldn't accept it. Those were his sons, his biology, his responsibility. He could fix this. He had lawyers and money and determination. He could force Tanya to acknowledge his rights. He could make her let him be part of their lives whether she wanted him there or not. Gold picked up his phone and called his lawyer. He said he wanted to file for custody. He said he wanted paternity established legally. He said he didn't care about publicity or cost or how difficult Tanya made it. Those were his children, and he had rights. His lawyer sighed and asked if Gold was sure. Gold said he'd never been more sure of anything. The lawyer said he'd prepare the paperwork. Gold hung up and felt something like victory, not understanding yet that forcing your way into lives that had learned to function without you wasn't victory. It was just another kind of cruelty disguised as love. Chapter 6. The Other Man. Silas Hartwell had learned about suffering in an operating room 3 years ago when his wife had stopped breathing and his daughter had never started. He'd been in the hallway waiting because doctors weren't allowed to be present for their own family's procedures, standing outside listening to the emergency that unfolded when Grace's blood pressure had spiked and the baby's heart rate had plummeted. He'd heard the code being called, had heard running feet and urgent voices, had known with clinical precision what every sound meant: hemorrhage, distress, crash cart, full arrest. He'd stood there with his medical knowledge painting pictures his heart couldn't survive. And when they'd finally let him in, Grace was gone, and the baby girl they'd named Emma had lived for exactly 10 minutes before her underdeveloped lungs had given up. Silas had held his daughter while she died, had watched her struggle for air he couldn't give her, had felt her tiny body go still against his chest. The grief had been complete, annihilating, the kind that made you understand why people walked into oceans and didn't come back. He'd taken a leave from the hospital in Seattle, where he'd been rising fast through the trauma surgery ranks, had moved into Grace's parents' house because his own apartment felt haunted, had spent months doing nothing except breathing and trying to remember why breathing mattered. Eventually, he'd gone back to work because bodies kept breaking and someone had to fix them. But Seattle had too many memories: restaurants where he'd eaten with Grace, parks where they'd walked, the hospital where she'd died. He'd requested a transfer anywhere else. Harborview Regional had needed a trauma surgeon. Silas hadn't cared where it was. He'd packed up his life, driven down the coast, rented the first cottage he'd seen, and tried to learn how to exist alone. Then he'd heard babies crying through the walls and recognized the sound of someone drowning. He'd ignored it for a week, telling himself everyone had their struggles and his help wasn't wanted. But the crying continued every night, and Silas knew exhaustion when he heard it, knew the particular desperation of being solely responsible for life, too fragile to risk failing. On the 8th night, when he'd heard a woman sobbing in a bathroom, he'd gone to the store and bought groceries and left them on her porch like an anonymous gift because he remembered people doing the same for him after Grace died. The woman, Tanya, he'd learned later, had been suspicious initially. She'd looked at the groceries like they might be poisoned, had knocked on his door with distrust written across her face. But Silas had learned that grief and exhaustion made you too tired for pride. Eventually, she'd accepted his help because refusing it meant her children suffered, and mothers didn't let pride hurt their children. He'd started watching the twins when Tanya had meetings. She'd knock on his door with desperation in her eyes and babies in her arms, and Silas would take them for 2 hours or 3 while she worked. He'd learned their rhythms fast. Zephyr liked movement, needed to be walked and bounced constantly. Phoenix preferred warmth, would settle if you held him against your chest, where he could hear your heartbeat. They were easy babies once you understood them, and Silas understood babies because he'd spent months preparing for Emma, reading books and taking classes with Grace, learning techniques he'd thought he'd use forever. Tanya never asked about his past. She never pried into why a trauma surgeon with Seattle credentials was living in a rental cottage in Harborview. She accepted his help with the kind of gratitude that came from having no other options, and slowly over months, she'd started staying after she picked up the twins. She'd have coffee while Silas held Phoenix and explained his day in one-sided conversation that made the infant smile. She'd sit on his porch steps while Zephyr napped against Silas's shoulder and talk about design projects she was working on, about how raising twins alone was harder than anyone admitted, about being tired in ways sleep couldn't fix. Silas had listened because listening was easy. He'd learned not to offer advice or solutions unless asked, because people dealing with impossible situations didn't need someone explaining how to survive. They needed someone to acknowledge that survival was exhausting. Tanya seemed to understand that. She never asked him to fix her problems. She just sat with him and existed in the same space, and that companionship was enough. Eventually she'd told him about gold, about the wedding night bet, about signing annulment papers while wearing her dress, about disappearing because she couldn't bear the thought of raising children connected to cruelty. She'd told him with the flat affect of someone recounting facts rather than wounds, and Silas had recognized trauma presenting as numbness. He'd told her about Grace and Emma, about the 10 minutes he'd held his daughter while she died, about moving here because grief required geography to be survivable. They'd become friends first, two people who'd learned that terrible things happened to people who didn't deserve them, that rebuilding was possible but exhausting, that loneliness was bearable when someone else understood it. Tanya never asked for more than friendship. Silas never offered it. They existed in parallel, helping each other survive, and that had been enough, until it wasn't. The shift had happened gradually. Silas would find himself thinking about Tanya while performing surgery, wondering if she'd gotten Phoenix to sleep, if she'd eaten anything besides peanut butter sandwiches. He'd come home and feel disappointed if her cottage was dark, relieved when he saw lights on and knew she was managing. He'd started looking forward to the knock on his door that meant she needed help, to the conversations on his porch after the twins were settled, to the way Tanya smiled when one of his babies did something ridiculous. His babies. He'd started thinking of Zephyr and Phoenix that way, without meaning to, had caught himself telling colleagues about them like they were his sons, had bought them clothes and toys because Tanya couldn't afford them and refused gifts from Gold. He'd fallen in love with those twins the way you fall asleep. Slowly, then all at once, until you couldn't remember not loving them. And he'd fallen in love with Tanya too. Not the desperate love of someone trying to replace what he'd lost. Grace would always be irreplaceable. But the careful love of someone who'd learned that hearts could hold more than one person, that loving again didn't diminish what came before. He'd fallen for Tanya's strength, her refusal to be broken by betrayal, her dedication to her sons, the way she laughed when she was too tired to be careful about hiding joy. He hadn't told her. He'd been waiting for the right moment, waiting until she seemed ready to hear it, waiting until Gold stopped hovering at the edges of her life like a ghost she couldn't exorcise. But Gold hadn't stopped. He'd filed for custody, forcing Tanya into legal battles she couldn't afford emotionally or financially. He'd hired expensive lawyers who were building cases that painted Tanya as vindictive, painting Gold as a reformed man seeking redemption through fatherhood. Silas had watched Tanya read the custody papers, had seen her face go blank the way it did when she was protecting herself from feeling too much. He'd asked what she wanted. She'd said she wanted to make sure Gold never touched her children. Silas had understood then that he couldn't just be supportive anymore. He had to be present actively, had to prove to any judge that these twins had a father figure who'd been there every single day, who'd earned his place through consistency and love rather than biology and guilt. So, on a Wednesday evening after putting both twins to bed and finding Tanya washing dishes with mechanical exhaustion, Silas had asked her to marry him. Not romantically. There had been no candles or music or grand gestures. Just him standing in her kitchen with a simple ring he'd bought that afternoon, saying words he'd practiced 50 times in his head. I love you. I love them. Let me be your family officially. Tanya had stared at the ring like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Then she'd started crying. Not sad crying, but the kind of crying that came from holding too much inside for too long. Silas had put the ring on the counter and held her while she broke apart, her body shaking against his, her tears soaking his shirt. He'd held her until she stopped, until she could breathe again, until she stepped back and wiped her face with the kind of embarrassment that came from letting someone see you completely. She hadn't said yes that night. She'd taken the ring and held it, and asked for time. Silas had given it gladly, had told her he'd wait as long as she needed, had meant it with every part of himself. He'd gone back to his cottage and lain awake thinking about Grace, silently asking her if this was okay, if loving someone else meant forgetting her. He'd felt no answer because dead people didn't answer questions. But he'd imagined her response would be that love wasn't finite, that he'd been alone long enough, that Emma would have wanted siblings, even if they weren't biologically hers. The next morning, Tanya had knocked on his door before dawn. She'd been holding both twins, her hair uncombed, wearing pajamas and a jacket. She'd said, "I'm terrified. I don't know if I can trust this, but I want to try." She'd handed him the ring still in its box and said, "Ask me again when I'm not crying and exhausted." Silas had taken the ring and asked her then, standing in his doorway at sunrise with babies between them and their breath visible in cold air. Tanya had said yes. Phoenix had started fussing. Zephyr had grabbed Silas's shirt. They'd gone inside and made breakfast together like they'd done it 1,000 times before, and Silas had understood that marriage didn't always start with passion and proposal. Sometimes it started with eggs and coffee and the decision to build family deliberately rather than waiting for it to arrive perfectly. They'd set a date, small ceremony, just them and the twins and a handful of people Silas worked with. Tanya had started designing her own dress, something simple that wouldn't feel like mockery of the wedding dress she'd worn while Gold laughed. Silas had filed adoption paperwork that would be finalized after the marriage, establishing legal parenthood that would protect the twins if anything happened to Tanya. The custody trial approached like a storm. Tanya prepared with her lawyer, rehearsing testimony, organizing evidence, trying to stay calm. Silas prepared too, gathering character references from colleagues, documenting his role in the twins' lives, making sure any judge would see him as a father in every meaningful way. Gold might have biolo, yeah. Silas had presence. And in the end, presence mattered more. One evening, a week before trial, Gold showed up at Tanya's cottage, drunk and desperate. Silas had been there, had been staying most nights because Tanya couldn't sleep and needed someone present who wasn't a 6-month-old infant. He'd heard Gold's car pull up, had heard the pounding on the door, had stood behind Tanya when she opened it with the chain lock engaged. Gold had looked terrible, expensive suit rumpled, hair disheveled, eyes red from drinking or crying or both. He'd started talking fast, words tumbling over each other, explaining how he'd felt since seeing her in the hospital, admitting he'd been cruel, saying he wanted to be a father, begging for a chance. He'd talked for 10 minutes straight, his voice breaking, his hands gripping the doorframe like he might fall without support. Tanya had listened in silence. When Gold finally stopped, exhausted by his own confession, Tanya had spoken with a voice so cold, Silas had felt the temperature drop. She told Gold he'd stopped being relevant to her life months ago, that he wasn't a villain anymore but an absence, a blank space where a father should be. She'd said Zephyr and Phoenix would never know him because he'd chosen to be nothing when he'd signed those papers. She'd added that if she married Silas, he'd adopt the twins legally, and Gold would disappear from their lives completely. Gold had tried to argue. Silas had stepped forward and simply closed the door. He'd heard Gold standing outside, heard him eventually leave, heard Tanya's shaky breathing as she processed having faced her destroyer and survived. Silas had held her that night while she slept fitfully, and he'd understood that loving Tanya meant accepting she carried scars he couldn't heal, that Gold would always be the ghost in her past, even if he never appeared in her present. But Silas could live with ghosts. He'd been living with Grace's ghost for 3 years. Ghosts weren't competition. They were reminders that you'd loved before and could love again, that loss didn't mean the end of everything, that hearts broken properly could be rebuilt stronger. Tanya's heart was broken and rebuilding. Silas's heart was scarred and opening. Together they could make something new, not a replacement for what they'd lost, but an addition to their stories, a chapter about second chances and chosen family. Gold filed his custody suit 2 days later. Tanya received the papers while feeding the twins breakfast. She'd read them carefully, called her lawyer, prepared for war. Silas had come home from a 20-hour shift to find her sitting at the kitchen table with documents spread everywhere, her face expressionless in the way that meant she was holding too much inside. He'd asked what she wanted. Tanya had said she wanted to make sure Gold never touched her children. Silas had sat down across from her and said, "Then we make sure. Whatever it takes. I'm not going anywhere." And he'd meant it. He'd stand in any courtroom and explain how he'd watched these twins grow, how he knew Phoenix preferred being held horizontally while Zephyr liked vertical, how they both smiled at specific songs, how Zephyr was cautious while Phoenix was bold. He'd explain what it meant to be present every single day, to wake up at 3 in the morning for feedings, to celebrate first smiles and first laughs, to worry about every cough and cry. He'd explain that being a father wasn't about DNA sequences, it was about showing up. Gold might have given Tanya those twins biologically, but Silas had been their father since the first night he'd heard them crying through walls and decided to help. And no court could take that away because you couldn't legislate love. You could only recognize it when it was presented honestly. Silas looked at Tanya across the table, covered with legal documents, and thought about the family they were building deliberately, carefully, from the wreckage of their separate losses. It wasn't the family either of them had imagined, but it was theirs, and that made it worth fighting for. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. Goldsmith drove to Harborview at midnight on a Tuesday, drunk on expensive whiskey and desperation that tasted like failure. The decision had been building for weeks, through meetings where lawyers explained his weak legal position, through surveillance reports showing Silas becoming more integrated into the twins' lives, through nights alone in his penthouse wondering when he'd become the kind of man who had to beg for access to his own children. The acquisition had finalized. He was richer now by hundreds of millions. His bank accounts had numbers that meant nothing. His success felt hollow. His life felt like an expensive simulation of living, all surface and no substance, a tower of glass where nothing real could survive. He'd started drinking around 9, whiskey neat because complicated drinks required care he couldn't muster. By 11, he'd finished half a bottle and made a decision that sobriety would have prevented. He'd gotten in his car. He'd hire lawyers later if he got pulled over, money fix those problems, and driven 4 hours to a cottage where lights were still burning at midnight because babies didn't respect adult schedules. He parked badly, taking up space across 2 spots, not caring. He walked to Tanya's door and pounded on it with fists that felt disconnected from his body. A minute passed. 2. Then the door opened 6 inches, chain lock engaged, and Tanya stood there in a robe with Silas visible behind her wearing sweatpants and no shirt, like he lived there, like he belonged in her space at midnight, like he'd earned intimacy Gold had destroyed. "Go home," Tanya said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "You're drunk. I need to talk to you." Gold's words slurred slightly. He hadn't realized how much whiskey he'd consumed until speaking became difficult. "I need you to understand what I've been feeling since I saw you in that hospital." "I don't care what you've been feeling." Tanya started to close the door. Gold jammed his foot in the gap, stopping it. "Please, 5 minutes. I'll leave after that. I promise." Silas stepped forward, putting himself between Tanya and the door. She said, "Go home. Remove your foot, or I'm calling the police." Gold looked at Silas. This quiet man who'd slipped into his family like water finding cracks, who'd earned through presence what Gold had lost through cruelty. Rage flared hot and irrational. "Those are my sons inside, my children. You have no right to tell me anything." "I have every right." Silas's voice stayed calm, clinical, the tone of someone used to dealing with emergencies while maintaining composure. "I'm the one who's been here. I'm the one who wakes up at 3 in the morning when they cry. I'm the one who's earned the title of father by doing the work you refuse to do." The words hit harder than fists would have. Gold stepped back, his foot leaving the doorway. "You don't understand. I made a mistake. I was someone else then. I'm different now. I've changed." "You haven't changed." Tanya's voice cut through the night air with precision that suggested she'd been thinking about this speech for months. You're just uncomfortable with consequences. Changing means doing the work before you need redemption, not after you realize guilt hurts. Changing means being better because it's right, not because you want credit for improvement. I want to know them. Gold heard the desperation in his voice, the pleading tone that sounded pathetic even to his own ears. I want to be their father. You chose not to be their father when you signed annulment papers laughing about a bet. Tanya's face was stone, unmoved by his distress. You chose not to be their father when you knew I was pregnant and did nothing. You chose not to be their father every single day you knew they existed and stayed away. You don't get to choose differently now because loneliness became uncomfortable. Gold felt something break inside his chest, something fundamental cracking. What do I have to do? Tell me what I have to do to fix this. You can't fix this. Tanya's words were final as doors closing. This isn't broken furniture or a business deal. This lives you damaged. Zephyr and Phoenix are not therapy for your guilt. They're human beings who deserve a father who chose them from the beginning, not someone who showed up late demanding credit for biology. Gold started talking then, words pouring out uncontrolled, explaining how he'd felt watching her nearly die, how he'd thought about her every day since, how he'd been empty before he'd met her and emptier after he'd destroyed her. He explained the bet with the desperation of someone who believed confession absolved sin, who thought admitting awfulness made awfulness forgivable. He said he wished he could undo every moment of that night, wished he'd never made the bet, wished he'd been better from the beginning. Tanya listened to all of it with a face like marble. When Gold finally ran out of words and stood there breathing hard and feeling tears he didn't remember crying on his face, Tanya spoke with a gentleness that felt crueler than anger. I believe you feel guilty, she said. I believe you regret what you did. But guilt isn't love. Regret isn't commitment. You're here because you need forgiveness to feel better about yourself. You're not here because you want to know Zephyr and Phoenix as people. You're here because they represent redemption, and you've decided you deserve redemption without earning it. That's not true. But even as Gold said it, he wondered if it was a lie, if his desperation to be a father was really just desperation to prove he wasn't the monster he'd become in his own mind. I stopped thinking about you months ago, Tanya continued. You're not a villain in my story anymore. You're an absence. A blank space where a father should be, and that's all you'll ever be because I won't let you use my children to feel better about yourself. Silas put his hand on the door, preparing to close it. Gold looked at him and saw someone who'd won without fighting, who'd claimed his family through the radical act of showing up consistently. If you marry her, I'll fight it in court. I'll fight the adoption. I'll make sure everyone knows you're trying to steal my sons. I'm not stealing anything. Silas's voice stayed quiet, certain. They're already mine in every way that matters. A judge will see that. Everyone will see that. Being a father isn't about biology. It's about being present every day, not when it's convenient, not when you finally realize what you're missing, but every single day from the beginning. Silas closed the door. The lock engaged. Gold stood on the porch, hearing Tanya's voice soothing one of the twins who'd woken up crying, hearing Silas's low murmur joining hers, hearing the sounds of a family functioning without him. He stood there for 10 minutes before stumbling back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat and called a rideshare because even drunk and destroyed, some part of him still functioned enough to avoid killing someone else on the road. He left his car in Harborview and took a car back to the city, arriving at his penthouse at 5 in the morning. He walked through rooms filled with expensive furniture and felt nothing except the crushing emptiness of a life built around acquisition with nothing acquired that mattered. He went to his bathroom and threw up whiskey and shame. He lay on his bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. By 9, he was sober enough to call his lawyer. He said he wanted to proceed with the custody case, wanted to file immediately, wanted the most aggressive legal team money could hire. His lawyer asked again if Gold was certain, explained this would be public and ugly, explained Gold's position was weak. Gold said he didn't care. He wanted his day in court. He wanted Tanya forced to acknowledge his existence. He wanted to prove biology mattered more than presence. His lawyer sighed and said he'd prepare the paperwork. Gold hung up and looked around his office at framed photos of properties he owned, at awards for business excellence, at evidence of a life built around winning. He'd won every significant battle he'd fought until this one. He'd believed success was about determination and resources. He'd believed problems dissolved when you threw enough money at them. But this problem wasn't dissolving. It was hardening into something permanent. A wall between him and his children built from his own choices, reinforced by Tanya's determination to protect them from him. He couldn't buy his way past it. He couldn't charm his way through it. He could only force his way in with lawyers and legal claims and the brutal machinery of a court system designed to establish facts rather than heal wounds. Gold prepared for war because war was the only language he understood. He gathered evidence, DNA tests, financial records proving he could provide better than Tanya, character witnesses who'd testify he'd changed. He built a case designed to dismantle Tanya's claim that he was irrelevant, designed to paint her as vindictive and him as reformed. His lawyers crafted arguments that sounded persuasive on paper, arguments that framed biology as destiny and his absence as circumstance rather than choice. But late at night, alone in his tower, Gold wondered if winning this case would actually win him anything. Even if a judge granted him visitation, even if he was legally allowed to see Zephyr and Phoenix, would they want to know him? Would they look at him with the trust children gave fathers, or would they sense the transaction at the heart of his attention? Would they love him eventually, or would they tolerate his court-ordered presence while counting minutes until they could return to the man who'd been there from the beginning? Gold didn't have answers. He only had lawyers and money and determination. So he prepared for trial and told himself that winning legal custody meant winning fatherhood, that a judge's order could transform biology into family, that law could replace love if you argued well enough. He believed this because believing otherwise meant accepting he'd destroyed something irreplaceable, that some consequences couldn't be overcome with wealth and persistence, that you couldn't bet on breaking someone's heart and expect to collect on redemption later. The custody papers were filed on a Thursday. Tanya received them while feeding the twins breakfast. Gold's lawyers had delivered them personally, had waited while Tanya signed for service, had left her sitting at her kitchen table with legal documents spread everywhere, and her world shifting toward confrontation she'd tried to avoid. Silas came home from a night shift at the hospital to find her still sitting there, Phoenix and Zephyr playing on the floor nearby, her face expressionless. He read the papers over her shoulder. Gold's lawyers were asking for joint custody, were claiming Tanya had deliberately alienated the twins from their biological father, were painting her as vengeful and manipulative. They'd included photographs of Gold, carefully chosen images showing him looking respectable and remorseful, nothing like the man who'd shown up drunk at midnight. "What do you want?" Silas asked. Tanya looked at her sons playing with blocks on the floor, looked at these small humans she'd created and protected and loved with ferocity that sometimes scared her. She thought about Gold's laughter on their wedding night, about bleeding out after giving birth alone, about every moment since when she'd chosen them over everything else. She looked at Silas, who'd been present without being asked, who'd loved without requiring reciprocity, who'd proven that kindness existed outside transaction. "I want to make sure he never touches my children," Tanya said. "I want them to know their worth isn't measured by whether someone who hurt me decides he wants to claim them. I want them to grow up safe." Silas knelt beside her chair and took her hand. "Then we make sure. We go to court. We tell the truth. We show any judge who'll listen that family is built, not claimed, and we win." Tanya squeezed his hand and hoped he was right, hoped that justice would see past biology to presence, hoped that a court system designed to protect children would actually protect hers. But she'd learned that hope was dangerous, that people you trusted could destroy you, that promises meant nothing when tested by convenience. Still, she had no choice. Gold had forced this confrontation. Now she'd face it with everything she had: truth, determination, and a man beside her who'd proven that love without cruelty was possible. She'd walk into that courtroom and fight for her sons with the same ferocity she'd used to survive everything else. And maybe, if law aligned with justice for once, she'd walk back out with her family intact, and Gold finally, permanently erased from their lives. The trial was scheduled for 3 weeks away. Tanya called her lawyer and began preparing for battle, knowing that some wars couldn't be avoided, only fought with enough conviction that winning became the only acceptable outcome. She'd survived Gold once, she'd survive him again, and this time she'd make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else she loved. Chapter 8. The Public Destruction. The story broke on a Tuesday morning across social media platforms like wildfire consuming dry timber. Someone had leaked the details, a reporter with connections to the courthouse, or maybe one of Gold's former friends who'd participated in the bet, or perhaps just someone who'd heard the story and decided the public deserved to know. The headline appeared first on a regional news site, then spread to larger outlets within hours. Millionaire CEO bet $2 million he could marry and divorce woman same day, now seeks custody of resulting twins. The article included everything: the wedding night betrayal, the annulment papers, Tanya's disappearance and survival, Gold's sudden interest in fatherhood after months of absence, the custody battle framing a reformed man against a vindictive mother. Except public opinion didn't frame it that way. People read the story and saw a monster who'd gambled with a woman's heart, who'd documented her grief for entertainment, who'd left her to bleed nearly to death while giving birth to his children, who now wanted credit for biology without having done any work of fatherhood. Comment sections exploded with rage. Gold's hotels were review-bombed by people who'd never stayed there but wanted to punish him. His business partners received thousands of emails demanding they sever ties. His personal social media accounts were flooded with messages calling him irredeemable, calling him the worst kind of predator who wrapped cruelty in expensive suits. Gold watched his reputation disintegrate in real time. His publicist quit via email, saying she couldn't represent someone whose actions were indefensible. His board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss whether his presence was damaging the company's brand. Former friends who'd participated in the bet suddenly had no recollection of events, claiming they'd tried to talk Gold out of it, claiming they'd been disgusted by his behavior. Everyone who'd laughed with him at poker games now pretended horror and distance. Within 72 hours, Meridian International suspended their acquisition, pending resolution of legal matters. Their CEO released a statement saying they couldn't partner with someone whose personal conduct contradicted their corporate values. Gold's stock portfolio dropped. His net worth declined by tens of millions as investors distanced themselves from toxicity. His lawyers advised settling immediately, offering Tanya whatever she wanted financially, in exchange for dropping all claims against his public reputation. Gold refused. He'd gone too far to retreat now. Backing down meant admitting defeat, meant accepting he'd destroyed his life for nothing. He told his lawyers to proceed with trial, told them to build the case painting Tanya as vindictive despite public opinion, told them money was unlimited for this fight. His lawyers looked at him with the pity people reserved for drowning men who refused lifeboats, but they took his money and prepared their arguments. Meanwhile, Tanya became a sympathetic figure. A women's magazine contacted her for an interview, offering payment she couldn't refuse. They sent a photographer to Harborview, did a feature shoot at the cottage with Tanya holding Zephyr and Phoenix while sunlight poured through windows. Silas was visible in background shots, fixing the porch railing, making coffee in the kitchen, existing in their space with the comfortable presence of family. The article detailed Tanya's architectural achievements, her survival after betrayal, her determination to protect her children, her rebuilding of life from ashes. The interviewer asked about Gold. Tanya's response became famous, quoted across social media platforms and printed on T-shirts by people who'd never met her. He taught me that some people see love as a transaction. I chose to see my children as a gift I gave myself. The article portrayed her as strong without being vindictive, damaged without being broken, a woman who'd survived cruelty and built something beautiful from wreckage. Comments praised her resilience. Women shared their own stories of betrayal and survival. Tanya became a symbol of refusing to be destroyed by men who thought power meant permission to hurt. Gold read the article 3 times and felt something like vertigo. The woman in those photographs looked nothing like the person he'd married. That Tanya had been soft, eager to please, desperate for connection. This Tanya was steel wrapped in determination, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with strength earned through suffering. Silas appeared in the background of photos like he belonged there, holding Phoenix with the casual competence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, making Tanya laugh in a captured moment that showed them as a unit functioning with synchronized ease. Gold looked at those photographs and understood he'd created this, not just the betrayal that had forced Tanya to become harder, but the family that had formed in his absence. Silas existed in Gold's place because Gold had abandoned that place. Zephyr and Phoenix smiled at Silas, because Silas had been there to earn their smiles. Tanya had rebuilt herself into someone extraordinary because surviving Gold had required becoming extraordinary. He'd destroyed her, and she'd used the pieces to build something better than what he'd broken. The custody hearing approached with media attention that made privacy impossible. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. News vans parked on Gold Street, filming his penthouse building, interviewing neighbors who claimed they'd always thought he was arrogant. Tanya's cottage in Harborview became a pilgrimage site for supporters who left flowers and notes of encouragement on her porch. She hired security to keep people away, uncomfortable with being transformed into a public figure when she'd only wanted to raise her children in peace. Gold's lawyers advised him repeatedly to settle. They explained his position was worse than weak. It was indefensible in the court of public opinion and questionable in actual court. Biology gave him some claim, but abandonment for months undermined that claim significantly. Tanya's lawyer had character witnesses, had documentation of her sole support, had Silas ready to testify about his role in the twins' lives. Gold's lawyers had DNA tests and arguments that parental alienation was abuse, that Tanya's refusal to include him was vengeful rather than protective. 1 week before trial, Gold met with his legal team in a conference room that felt like a bunker. They laid out the strategy: attack Tanya's character, paint her as someone who weaponized children, argue that biological fathers had rights regardless of past behavior. Gold listened to them explain how they'd cross-examine Tanya, how they'd make her look vindictive, how they'd present Gold as reformed and repentant. He listened and felt sick. "This will destroy her publicly," his lead lawyer said. "We'll have to bring up the pregnancy concealment, make it look deliberate and cruel. We'll have to suggest she's unstable, that her choices were motivated by revenge rather than protection. It's ugly, but it's effective." Gold looked around the table at lawyers who were being paid to dismantle a woman he'd already destroyed once. He thought about Tanya sitting in a hospital bed bleeding while he'd stood in the hallway watching, thought about her raising his children alone while he'd been collecting money from a bet, thought about her becoming someone extraordinary specifically because she'd survived him. He thought about whether winning this case would actually win him anything meaningful, or if it would just prove he could hurt Tanya twice. But his pride wouldn't let him walk away. His ego couldn't accept that Silas had won by default, that biology meant nothing against presence, that you couldn't force your way into family through legal claims. He told his lawyers to proceed. They nodded and continued planning Tanya's professional destruction. The day before trial, Gold sat alone in his penthouse and looked at the city lights spread below him like evidence of his success. He'd built an empire from ambition and ruthlessness. He'd climbed over competitors and obstacles without hesitation. He'd believed winning justified any strategy, that consequences were for people too weak to protect themselves from them. He'd lived by those principles and become wealthy and powerful and completely devastatingly alone. His phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. "Final chance to settle. After tomorrow, we're committed to war." Gold looked at the message and knew the smart choice was settlement, was offering Tanya enough money that she could rebuild her life somewhere far away from him, was accepting defeat with grace and disappearing from her story entirely. But he'd never been good at accepting defeat. He'd never learned when fighting made things worse. He'd built his life around winning at any cost, and now that cost was going to be counted in a courtroom where everyone would see exactly who he'd become. Gold typed a response. "Proceed with trial." He sent it and sat in the dark, watching the city lights blur into meaningless patterns, understanding he'd crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross, that tomorrow would reveal him publicly as exactly what he'd always been privately. A man who loved winning more than he loved anything else, including the people he claimed to care about. The next morning, Gold put on his most expensive suit and drove to the courthouse where protesters held signs calling him a monster. He walked past cameras and shouted questions, and people who looked at him with the kind of contempt usually reserved for criminals. He entered the courtroom where Tanya sat with her lawyer, where Silas sat in the gallery holding Zephyr while a social worker held Phoenix, where his entire life was about to be examined and judged by strangers who'd already decided he was irredeemable. He sat at the defendant's table and waited for his name to be called, waited for the battle to begin, waited to discover if law cared about biology or presence, if judges ruled based on rights or earned trust, if you could force your way into family, or if family only existed when built deliberately from love and time and the radical act of showing up. He waited and understood that regardless of what the judge decided, he'd already lost everything that mattered. The question now was whether he'd lose legally too, or if law would grant him a victory that felt hollow because winning through force wasn't really winning at all. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge entered. The trial began. And Goldsmith discovered that some consequences couldn't be avoided through wealth or charm or determination. Some consequences just existed, permanent and devastating. Reminders that actions had weight and choices had costs and cruelty always came back around eventually, dressed in courtroom formality and carrying the power to take away everything you'd decided too late that you wanted. Chapter 9. The Proposal and the Decision. Silas Hartwell proposed to Tanya Finch on a Wednesday evening while washing dishes in her small kitchen, the twins finally asleep after an exhausting day. There had been no planning, no grand gesture, no dramatic setup. Just Silas drying a plate and looking at Tanya, scrubbing a pot with mechanical exhaustion, her face drawn from too many sleepless nights preparing for trial, her hands trembling slightly from stress that had nowhere to go except into her body. He'd been thinking about the proposal for weeks, had bought the ring a month ago and kept it in his pocket, waiting for the right moment. Then he'd realized there would never be a perfect moment, that waiting for ideal circumstances meant never acting, that love didn't require perfect timing, it just required honesty. "Marry me," he'd said, setting down the dish towel and pulling the small box from his pocket. "I love you. I love them. Let me be your family officially." Tanya had stared at the ring like it was something from another planet. Something that didn't belong in her kitchen with its chipped counters and second-hand appliances. Her hands had gone still in the soapy water. She'd looked at the ring, then at Silas, then back at the ring. And then she'd started crying, not delicate tears but the kind of sobbing that came from somewhere deep and broken, the kind that suggested she'd been holding herself together through pure will, and the will had finally cracked. Silas had put the ring on the counter and held her while she fell apart. She'd pressed her face into his chest and cried like she hadn't cried since the wedding night, like all the tears she'd saved for 9 months were escaping at once. He'd held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Sometimes people needed to break before they could rebuild, needed to release what they'd been carrying before they could accept something new. When she'd finally stopped, when she'd pulled back and wiped her face with embarrassment that came from letting someone see complete vulnerability, Tanya had picked up the ring box and held it without opening it. "I don't know if I can do this," she'd whispered. "I don't know if I can trust this." "You don't have to decide tonight," Silas had said. Take the time you need. I'll be here tomorrow, and the day after, and every day following. I'm not going anywhere, regardless of your answer." Tanya had taken the ring and gone to bed without saying yes or no, leaving Silas in the kitchen wondering if he'd made a mistake, if proposing now had been pressure she didn't need when she was already drowning in legal battles. He'd gone back to his own cottage and lain awake thinking about Grace, silently asking his dead wife if this was okay, if moving forward meant leaving her behind. He'd gotten no answer because dead people didn't answer questions, but he'd felt something like peace, like permission to keep living even when living meant loving someone else. Over the next days, Silas watched Tanya test him in small ways, being difficult when she was usually accommodating, pulling back when she was usually open, saying things designed to provoke reaction. He recognized the pattern. She was checking if he'd stay when she wasn't easy, if his presence was conditional on her being grateful and manageable. He'd responded by staying exactly the same, patient, present, unwavering. He'd told her when she was being unfair, but he'd told her gently, and he hadn't left. He'd proven that his love wasn't transactional, that she could be difficult and human and scared without losing him. 3 days before the custody trial, Tanya had knocked on his door before sunrise. She'd been holding both twins, wearing pajamas and a jacket, her hair uncombed. She'd looked at him with eyes that were terrified and determined simultaneously. "I'm scared," she'd said. "I don't know if I can trust this, but I want to try." She'd handed him the ring box still unopened and said, "Ask me again when I'm not crying and exhausted." Silas had taken the box and asked her right there in his doorway at dawn, with babies between them and their breath visible in morning cold. "Tanya Finch, will you marry me?" "Yes," she'd said. And the word had sounded like a door opening instead of closing, like the beginning of something rather than the end. They'd gone inside and made breakfast together with Zephyr in a high chair and Phoenix in a bouncer, moving around each other with practiced ease that came from months of shared domesticity. They'd eaten eggs and toast while the twins babbled and threw food, and it had felt more real than any grand romantic gesture could have felt. Just two damaged people choosing each other deliberately, choosing to build family from intention, rather than waiting for it to arrive perfectly formed. They'd set the wedding date for the week after trial, regardless of outcome. Small ceremony at a chapel by the ocean, just them and the twins, and a handful of Silas's colleagues who'd become friends. Tanya had started designing her dress that afternoon, sketching in her architecture notebook between trial preparation notes, creating something simple that wouldn't feel like mockery of the wedding dress that had become costume for cruelty. Silas had filed adoption paperwork that would be finalized after marriage, establishing legal parenthood that would protect the twins if anything happened to Tanya, creating family through choice and documentation rather than just biology. Jennifer Moss, Tanya's lawyer, had been pleased when Tanya told her about the engagement. She'd explained that having Silas as a legal step-parent would strengthen their case dramatically, would show the judge that the twins had a stable two-parent home, would demonstrate that gold was unnecessary rather than essential. She'd filed motions updating their case to include Silas's pending adoption, had gathered character references from his colleagues about his presence in the twins' lives, had built a narrative about earned fatherhood versus biological claims. But the engagement also made Gold desperate. When his lawyers informed him that Tanya was planning to marry Silas and allow adoption, Gold had responded with fury that made his legal team nervous. He'd demanded they find ways to block the adoption, to argue that step-parent adoption was parental alienation, to make the case that Tanya was trying to erase him systematically. His lawyers had explained that judges generally favored stable two-parent homes, that blocking an adoption would make Gold look possessive rather than caring, that fighting this would damage his case more than help it. Gold hadn't cared. He'd told them to fight everything, to block every path Tanya tried to take, to make sure she understood he wouldn't be erased. His lawyers had exchanged glances that suggested they were representing a man too prideful to recognize when he'd lost, but they'd taken his money and filed motions that would be denied but would slow the process, would make Tanya's path harder, would punish her for choosing someone else. The night before trial, Gold had shown up at Tanya's cottage one final time. Tanya had been inside with Silas, both of them going over testimony notes while the twins slept. They'd heard the car pull up, had seen Gold through the window, standing at the edge of her property like he was afraid to come closer. Silas had wanted to call the police, but Tanya had stopped him. She'd gone outside alone to face Gold one last time before facing him in court. They'd stood in her front yard under stars, far enough from the cottage that Silas couldn't hear them, close enough that he could see them through the window. Gold had looked terrible, expensive suit wrinkled, hair disheveled, face haggard from too many sleepless nights. He'd stared at Tanya for a long moment before speaking. "If you marry him and let him adopt them, I'll never stop fighting," Gold had said. "I'll appeal every decision. I'll make your life hell for years. I'll use every resource I have to make sure you never know peace." Tanya had looked at him without expression. "You've already made my life hell. You did that the night you laughed while I signed divorce papers. Everything since has just been me surviving what you started. You can't threaten me with more of what I've already endured. Those are my sons." Gold's voice had cracked on the words. "My blood, my biology. You can't just erase me." "I'm not erasing you," Tanya had said. "You were never written into their story to begin with. Biology isn't fatherhood. Showing up when it's convenient isn't parenting. You're a stranger who shares their DNA. Silas is their father because he chose them every single day. That's the difference you'll never understand." Gold had stood there breathing hard, looking like a man watching everything he'd decided too late he wanted slip through his fingers. "I made a mistake, one mistake. How long do I have to pay for it?" "You didn't make one mistake," Tanya had said, her voice gentle in a way that felt crueler than anger. "You made 1,000 small choices that led to one catastrophic moment. You chose to make a bet. You chose to pursue me specifically because you thought I was vulnerable. You chose to learn my pain and use it to manipulate me. You chose to laugh when I signed papers that broke my heart. Every one of those was a separate decision. And then you made 1,000 more choices to stay away after you knew about the pregnancy. You don't get to reduce all of that to one mistake and claim you've paid enough." She turned and walked back toward the cottage, where Silas stood in the doorway with light behind him, where her children slept in cribs they'd outgrow soon, where her life existed complete without Gold in it. She'd paused at the porch steps and looked back at him one final time. "I hope you find peace," she'd said. "I hope you learn to live with what you did, but you'll do it without us. We're done being your redemption project." She'd gone inside and locked the door. Gold had stood in her yard for 30 minutes before getting in his car and driving away. Tanya had watched him leave from the window, Silas's arms around her waist, and felt something like relief. Tomorrow in court, she'd tell the truth. Tomorrow, a judge would decide if biology mattered more than presence. Tomorrow, she'd fight for her children with everything she had. Tonight, she just stood in her small cottage with the man who'd chosen her when she was difficult and broken, with her sons sleeping peacefully in the next room, with her life built deliberately from wreckage into something beautiful. She thought about the woman she'd been on her first wedding night, naive, trusting, desperate to be loved. She thought about the woman she'd become, scarred, careful, rebuilt from determination. She thought about the woman she was now, damaged but whole, loved but not dependent, a mother and soon-to-be wife who'd learned that family wasn't what happened to you, but what you built deliberately from choice and time and the radical act of showing up. "Tomorrow's going to be hard," Silas said quietly, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I know," Tanya said, "but we'll get through it. We've gotten through everything else." She turned in his arms and kissed him, and it felt nothing like kissing Gold had felt. No performance, no calculation, just two people who'd chosen each other despite every reason not to trust again. They stood in the kitchen where he'd proposed, where they'd made 1,000 meals together, where they'd built family from ordinary moments that added up to extraordinary love. Tomorrow, they'd fight. Tonight, they just existed together, whole and certain, ready to face whatever came next. Because some battles couldn't be avoided. They could only be fought with enough conviction that winning became inevitable. And Tanya had learned how to fight by surviving everything Gold had done to her. Now she'd use that same strength to make sure he never touched another thing she loved. Chapter 10. The Verdict of Love. The courtroom smelled like old wood and the collective anxiety of people whose lives were being decided by strangers in black robes. Tanya sat at the plaintiff's table with Jennifer Moss beside her, wearing a professional dress she'd borrowed from one of Silas's colleagues because her own clothes were too worn for court appearances. Behind her in the gallery, Silas sat holding Zephyr while a social worker held Phoenix. The twins were 9 months old now, starting to babble words that almost meant something, recognizing faces and voices, developing personalities that would shape who they became. Zephyr was cautious, studying things before touching them. Phoenix was bold, grabbing everything within reach. They were beautiful and perfect, and they were hers in ways that transcended biology. Gold sat across the aisle at the defendant's table, surrounded by 3 lawyers who'd been paid enormous amounts to present him as reformed and deserving. He was wearing an expensive suit that made him look respectable, his hair perfectly styled, his face arranged in an expression of remorseful hope. He looked nothing like the man who'd laughed on their wedding night, nothing like the man who'd shown up drunk and desperate at midnight. He looked like someone who'd learned from mistakes and deserved second chances. Tanya knew it was performance, the same performance he'd given when courting her, the same calculated presentation designed to hide cruelty beneath charm. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with grey hair and eyes that suggested she'd heard every lie people told and developed radar for truth. Everyone stood, then sat when she gestured. The bailiff called the case, Smith versus Finch, custody determination for minor children Zephyr and Phoenix Finch. The judge reviewed her notes, looked at both parties, and indicated Gold's lawyers should proceed. They built their case methodically. They presented DNA evidence establishing Gold as biological father. They presented financial records showing he could provide better than Tanya, bigger house, better schools, trust funds that would guarantee the twins' futures. They called character witnesses who testified Gold had changed, had become thoughtful and repentant, had demonstrated genuine desire to be a father. They argued that Tanya had deliberately concealed the pregnancy to deny Gold his parental rights, that her actions constituted parental alienation, that children deserved relationships with biological fathers, regardless of past conflict between parents. Gold took the stand. His lawyers had coached him well. He spoke about seeing Tanya in the hospital bed, about the moment that had changed him, about realizing he'd made a terrible mistake and wanting to make amends. He admitted the wedding night bet with carefully rehearsed remorse, framing it as youthful arrogance he'd outgrown. He talked about wanting to know his sons, about having capacity to provide them opportunities Tanya couldn't match, about believing children needed fathers. He cried, actual tears that might have been genuine or might have been performance art, impossible to distinguish. Tanya watched him testify and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction at seeing him struggle, just the neutral observation of someone who'd moved past caring. He was performing again, trying to win through emotion and presentation, believing tears brought forgiveness. But this wasn't a game he could win through charm. This was about truth, about presence, about who'd been there when presence mattered. Then Jennifer called Tanya's witnesses. First was Silas. He took the stand wearing a suit he clearly didn't wear often, looking uncomfortable in formal clothes but steady in purpose. Jennifer asked him to describe his relationship with the twins. Silas spoke quietly about meeting Tanya when she was drowning, about hearing babies cry through walls and deciding to help, about watching Zephyr and Phoenix grow from newborns to infants who recognized his face and reached for his arms. "Do you love these children?" Jennifer asked. Silas looked at Zephyr and Phoenix in the gallery, his face transforming with uncomplicated affection. "They're my sons in every way that matters. I've been there for every milestone. First smiles, first laughs, first time they rolled over. I know Phoenix prefers being held horizontally and Zephyr likes vertical. I know Zephyr studies things carefully before touching them, and Phoenix grabs everything immediately. I know they both calm down when you sing to them, that they like the same bedtime story read the same way every night, that they're developing different personalities that will make them remarkable people. I know these things because I've been present, because I showed up every single day, not when it was convenient, but when they needed me. "And do you intend to continue being present?" Jennifer asked. "I've filed adoption papers," Silas said. "The day after Tanya and I marry, I'll legally become their father, but legally doesn't matter as much as actually. I'll be their father because I'll keep showing up, because being a parent isn't about biology or legal documents. It's about being present every day, making them breakfast, changing diapers at 3 in the morning, teaching them to be kind. That's fatherhood, not showing up a year later demanding credit for genetics." Gold's lawyers cross-examined, trying to suggest Silas was replacement rather than genuine, trying to paint his presence as convenience rather than commitment. Silas answered every question with calm certainty, never becoming defensive, never claiming to be perfect, just present, consistently and deliberately, in ways that made him irreplaceable. Then Jennifer called Tanya. She walked to the stand, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her, feeling the weight of this moment that would determine her children's futures. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then sat and looked at Jennifer with determination that came from surviving everything else. Jennifer walked her through the timeline. Meeting Gold, the whirlwind courtship, the wedding night betrayal. Tanya spoke clearly, factually, no embellishment or drama. She described Gold explaining the bet, his laughter, the annulment papers signed while she still wore her dress. She described discovering she was pregnant, making the decision to disappear, building a life alone. She described going into labor with no one present, nearly dying while giving birth, recovering while caring for newborn twins with no support. "Why didn't you tell Mr. Smith about the pregnancy?" Jennifer asked. "Because he'd made it clear that our relationship was entertainment, that I was a character in a story he was telling for money and laughs," Tanya said. "I couldn't trust him with something as important as children. I chose to protect them from cruelty I'd already experienced. I chose them over any obligation to a man who'd chosen a bet over me." "Do you believe Mr. Smith has changed?" Jennifer asked. Tanya looked at Gold directly for the first time during trial. He was watching her with an expression that might have been hope or might have been fear. "I believe he feels guilty," she said. "I believe he regrets what he did. But guilt isn't the same as change. Change means being different before you need redemption, not after consequences become uncomfortable. He wants access to my children because they represent absolution. Because having them forgive him means he can forgive himself. He's not here because he loves them. He's here because he needs them." Gold's lawyers objected. The judge overruled and told Tanya to continue. "My children aren't therapy," Tanya said. "They're human beings who deserve a father who chose them from the beginning, who was present through hard things, who earned trust through consistency. Silas is that father. Goldsmith is a stranger who shares their DNA. Biology isn't love. Presence is love. And presence is the only thing that matters." Gold's lawyers cross-examined brutally, exactly as they'd promised. They asked why she'd concealed the pregnancy, suggesting vindictiveness rather than protection. They asked about her financial struggles, suggesting she was denying the twins' opportunities by refusing Gold's support. They asked if she was using the children to punish Gold for hurting her. They painted her as vengeful, as someone weaponizing children against their biological father. Tanya answered every question with steady calm. No, she wasn't being vindictive. She was being protective. No, her financial situation didn't make her a bad mother. It made her someone who worked hard to provide what her children needed. No, she wasn't weaponizing the twins. She was ensuring they grew up in a home where love wasn't transactional, where worth wasn't measured by entertainment value, where parents were present because they chose to be rather than because guilt made them uncomfortable. When the lawyers finally finished, when they'd exhausted their attempts to make her look unstable or cruel, Tanya stepped down from the witness stand feeling exhausted but certain. She'd told the truth. She'd presented her case. The rest was up to the judge. The judge took a week to deliberate. During that week, Tanya and Silas prepared for their wedding, setting up a small ceremony at a chapel by the ocean, arranging flowers and simple decorations, writing vows that felt true rather than traditional. They didn't discuss the trial. They didn't speculate about outcomes. They just moved forward with their lives, building family deliberately while waiting for law to catch up with what they already knew, that they belonged together, that the twins were Silas's sons regardless of what any document said. That love was built through time and choice, rather than claimed through biology and legal arguments. The verdict came down on a Friday morning. Everyone returned to the courtroom. Tanya and Silas, Gold and his lawyers, reporters in the gallery, social workers holding twins who didn't understand they were at the center of something momentous. The judge entered, and everyone stood, then sat when gestured. The judge looked at her notes, then at the parties involved, then began speaking. She addressed Gold first, acknowledging his biological connection to the twins, acknowledging his expressed desire to be a father. But then she detailed his choices: the wedding night bet, the annulment, the months of absence after learning about the pregnancy, the decision to file for custody only after seeing Tanya with the twins, rather than seeking them out immediately. She noted that Gold's actions demonstrated a pattern of self-interest rather than child-centered concern, that his timing suggested guilt rather than genuine paternal instinct. Then she addressed Tanya. She acknowledged the difficulty of single parenthood, the strength required to survive betrayal while pregnant, the commitment demonstrated by choosing children over convenience. She noted that while concealing the pregnancy might seem vindictive, it was reasonable given Gold's demonstrated character and the lack of legal obligation to inform someone who'd legally erased their marriage. Finally, she addressed Silas. She noted his presence from early in the twins' lives, his consistent involvement, his pending adoption papers, his demonstrated commitment to fatherhood through action rather than claim. She said the court recognized that fathers were made through presence, not just biology, that children needed stability and consistent care more than they needed biological connections to people who'd been absent. Her ruling was clear. Gold's petition for custody was denied. His petition for visitation was denied. The twins would remain in Tanya's sole custody. Silas's pending adoption would be approved upon his marriage to Tanya. However, the judge added a provision: when the twins reached adolescence and could express their own preferences, Gold could petition again to establish contact if he could demonstrate consistent, genuine change over years. But until then, the twins' need for stability outweighed Gold's desire for redemption. Gold sat motionless as the verdict was read. His lawyers looked disappointed but unsurprised. They'd known this was the likely outcome, had told him repeatedly to settle, had watched him insist on going to trial anyway because pride wouldn't let him accept defeat gracefully. Now he had his legal answer. Biology without presence meant nothing. Genetics without involvement granted no rights. Wanting to be a father after abandonment didn't create entitlement to fatherhood. Tanya felt nothing when she heard the decision. No victory, no relief, just quiet certainty that justice had aligned with truth for once. She thanked her lawyer, accepted Silas's embrace, took her sons from the social worker who'd been holding them. Phoenix grabbed her hair. Zephyr stared at all the people with cautious uncertainty. They were hers. They'd always been hers. Now law recognized what love had established. That evening, Tanya and Silas married at a chapel by the ocean, with sunset painting the sky orange and pink behind them. The ceremony was simple, an officiant reading traditional vows, Silas's colleagues serving as witnesses, the twins in little suits held by a friend who stood nearby. When the officiant asked if Tanya took Silas as her husband, she said yes without hesitation, her voice strong and certain. When Silas kissed her, Phoenix started babbling and Zephyr joined in, and everyone laughed at the twins' commentary on their parents' marriage. After the ceremony, they stood on the beach, Tanya in her simple dress, Silas in his suit, both holding babies who were getting too big to be called babies much longer. A photographer captured the moment, and Tanya thought about contrasts. Her first wedding in an expensive hotel, alone in a crowd, wearing a dress that cost thousands and meant nothing. This wedding on a beach, surrounded by a handful of people who actually cared, wearing a dress she'd designed herself that cost almost nothing and meant everything. "Are you happy?" Silas asked quietly, holding Zephyr against his shoulder while the baby pulled at his collar. "I didn't think I'd ever be happy again," Tanya said honestly. "After Gold, I thought happiness was something that happened to other people. But this feels right. It feels real. It feels like something I built rather than something that happened to me." "You did build it," Silas said. "You survived something that would have destroyed other people. You took wreckage and made it into family. That takes strength most people never develop." Tanya looked at the ocean, at the horizon where water met sky, and thought about the woman she'd been standing on a bridge deciding whether to jump. That woman had chosen life because of two cells dividing inside her body. Those cells had become Zephyr and Phoenix. Those twins had forced her to keep living when living seemed impossible. And living had led to Silas, to this moment, to understanding that revenge wasn't about destroying the person who hurt you. It was about building a life so beautiful they became irrelevant. Gold watched from his car at the edge of the beach parking lot. His investigator had told him about the wedding. He'd come because he couldn't not come, couldn't stop himself from seeing what he'd lost become official. He watched Tanya in her simple dress, watched Silas lift Phoenix into his arms, watched the four of them walk back toward the chapel as the sun set and cast everything in gold light that felt like mockery. He'd lost. The verdict had made it official. Biology meant nothing without presence. Genetics granted no rights without earned trust. He'd thrown away his chance before he'd known it was a chance, and now someone else was collecting what should have been his. His sons would grow up calling Silas father. They'd learn to walk holding his hands. They'd be shaped by his values, protected by his presence, loved by his consistency. Gold would be nothing to them, not even a villain. Just an absence, a blank space in their origin story. He started his car and drove away from the beach, from the chapel, from the family he'd destroyed before it could exist. He drove back to his city, to his penthouse, to his empty life built from success that felt stupid now. Money didn't fix this. Power didn't change this. He'd learned the hard way that some things couldn't be bought or forced or claimed. They could only be earned through time and presence and the choice to show up every single day. Months passed. Silas's adoption finalized. The family prepared to move to London for Tanya's international project, packing up the cottage that had been home during their hardest days. Zephyr and Phoenix learned to walk, stumbling around the living room while their parents cheered every wobbly step. They said their first words, Mama and Dada, pointing at Tanya and Silas with certainty about who their parents were. On a Tuesday morning while packing boxes, Tanya's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She opened it out of habit and found a text from Gold. "I'm sorry. I hope they have a good life." She read it once, felt nothing except faint surprise that he'd finally said something without demanding anything in return, and deleted it. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. That chapter had closed the day the judge ruled, had ended the day she'd married Silas, had finished the moment she'd understood that moving forward meant not looking back. She went to help Silas pack toys, while Phoenix pulled himself up on furniture, and Zephyr examined a cardboard box with serious concentration. Her sons, her husband, her family built deliberately from choice rather than accident. They'd move to London, build new lives, create memories in places that had no connection to Goldsmith. They'd be happy not because they'd destroyed him, but because they'd made him irrelevant through the simple act of building something beautiful he'd never touch. That was revenge, not forgiveness that let him off the hook, not hatred that kept him present in her thoughts, but indifference born from genuine happiness. She'd survived his cruelty and built an empire of love from the ashes. He'd remain alone in his tower made of glass and money and regret. while she'd live fully in a cottage made of laughter and presence and the radical choice to keep showing up. Tanya laughed at something Silas said. Phoenix tugged at her dress. Zephyr babbled nonsense that almost sounded like sentences. And somewhere far away, Goldsmith disappeared into irrelevance, while the family he'd destroyed rebuilt into something better than he'd ever deserved to be part of. The greatest revenge was not forgiveness. It was building a life so beautiful, the person who hurt you became a footnote in your origin story. Present, but unimportant. Mentioned, but not mourned. The villain who lost not because you destroyed him, but because you simply stopped caring whether he existed at all. The end.